have a wide community of people from all over joining in, which is really one of the joys and the benefits of being in a virtual space, as much as it's a detriment to not be able to gather in person. And as much as we would like to, it's also quite remarkable to see how far our reach can be when we don't have the physical limitations. So keep on telling us in the chat if you haven't yet who you are, where you're coming from, and how you came to hear about this event tonight. But it's now 7 o'clock or 4 o'clock where I am coming in from LA, depending on where people are located. And so we will get started. Thank you so much for coming tonight to this talk with Joy Ladin about poetry and more. We will be recording this talk so that those who can't make it at this moment can view it later. To introduce myself, my name is Ariel Zitny. I use the pronouns either he, him, or they, them. Either set works. I am a student at the Hebrew Union College. I am studying to get a master's in Jewish education, as well as studying for rabbinic ordination. So I will be ordained as a rabbi, hopefully in a few years. And I am also the director this year of the Trans Jews Are Here convening at CBST, which will be taking place this March 31st, which is Trans Day of Visibility. And while the convening will be a full day of events, celebrating and highlighting trans Jews and all that we bring to the community, and also the struggles that we face as trans Jews in Jewish community, we also want to make sure that we aren't just talking about trans Jews 1 or 2 days a year on Trans Day of Visibility and Trans Day of Remembrance. And we really want to highlight our identities and also the members of our community in more ways than just on these very important days. And while we do take those days to highlight and to talk about trans Jews and our community, we also want to make sure that this is a year-round conversation that we are including, talking about, and really fostering belonging with trans Jews to make sure that we don't feel like we're separate communities, like there is a Jewish community and a trans community, and that there isn't overlap with that. And so part of that is having conversations with trans Jews and talking about how we are a unique subsection of the community, being both trans and Jewish, but also there's so much more to us than our trans Jewish identities. And so today, part of that exploration with Dr. Joy Ladin is we'll be talking about how Joy, as a scholar, as a professor, as a writer, as a teacher, brings so much to our communities, both as a Jewish scholar, a trans scholar, and also just as an individual. So we will be talking about how we as individuals can transcend these labels and these marginalized identities that we hold, but also how integral that can be to our identities as well. So to formally introduce our guest, Dr. Joy Ladin is a professor of English and holds the David and Ruth Chapman Chair in English at Stern College. She received her PhD at Princeton, her MFA in creative writing from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and a BA from Sarah Lawrence College. Joy has won a number of awards, including a 2016 National Endowment for the Arts Creative Nonfiction Fellowship, a 2016 Hadassah Brandeis Research Fellowship. She has 3 times been a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award. She has twice been honored with Forward Fives Awards, and has received an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship and a Fulbright Scholarship. She is the author of 9 books of poetry, as well as a memoir entitled Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders, and most recently, a work of trans theology, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective. And so now that I've gotten the formal introduction out of the way, Joy, if you wouldn't mind to just informally introduce yourself, because I know that a list of scholarship and awards is only one aspect of you as a person. And if you wouldn't mind to just introduce yourself informally to us.
Thank you. I'm just so happy to be here with everybody. I'm really grateful for everyone who has shown up, and delighted to see faces I haven't seen in a while. And thank you, Ariel, for coming up with such a wonderful plan for us. I have to say, when I'm the sort of person who, when I hear other people's bios being read, I'm always envious. The weird thing is, I feel the same way when I hear my bio being read. It's like, yeah, why don't I have that stuff? And it's like, no, you do. So um, the I think that what I'm really excited about in the vision that you were laying out for the convening and how this event fits into it is, for me, poetry has always been the way that I could be, I used to say really alive, and I would say sort of all of myself at once now. Was not true in the poems that I wrote when I was living as a man. They tended, I would edit out aspects of myself or try to find other ways to say them. But at this point, I would say um, poetry is a place where it feels like all of the things that make me a human being can come together and enrich one another at once. And I feel like that's sort of the vision that you were saying about trans Jews, that we both want to be able to think about trans Jews as um, particular kind of intersectional group and community, but also um, as a place where we can recognize the richness of Jewishness and the richness of um, identity and identification, not so much a segregating off of a small part of an already not so big community as as a place where many different things can meet and where we can transfigure what comes through us. And that's in the writing the poetry that I've done, um, that deals with Jewish subjects, that's always the way that I felt. I felt like I'm, this weird little unit floating around on the edge of the Jewish people, but with access to the entire ocean of Jewish history and Jewish textual tradition. It's at my fingertips, and it's there to draw on when I write poetry. Um, so yeah, I'm just thrilled to be doing this. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. So there is one of your collections of poetry, the Book of Anna, is having a reissue, a second issue, and coming out this March 2021. And I wanted to just read a little bit about the Book of Anna from the press release of it. The Book of Anna is written in the voice of Anna Asher, a fictional Czech-German Jew who spent her adolescence in a concentration camp and now lives in 1950s Prague, answering phones for the secret police. This genre-defying book of prose diary entries and autobiographical poems offers intimate glimpses of Anna's present, her writing process, relationships with neighbors, obsessive sexual behavior, chain smoking, and idiosyncratic exploration of Jewish tradition, while the poems recount her unsparing efforts to reckon with horror, survival, and their aftermath. The book of Anna has a deep dive into this persona of Anna, a woman grappling to understand her experiences and her identity. And as writers, getting deep into a character can really be an escape, a way to get out of yourself and to become someone else. In this new edition, there is an afterword to the collection called Anna and Me. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the process of becoming Anna and
Mhm.
if that escape into the mind, body, and experience of another was, in a way, an opportunity to explore yourself.
That is, thank you. That's a great question. I want to show the um, the book because Trace Peterson, if I don't say the name of the press aloud because it's got too many vowels in it for me to know how to pronounce, um, but she did such a beautiful job laying out the book. And in the afterword, I talk about the way that Anna sort of arose from my life. And I'm not sure that I can really exactly answer your question because it's a bit of a mystery. Um, I started the Book of Anna without realizing that I had started it. I was finishing an MFA program that left me feeling completely despairing, actually, about ever having readers who and also thoroughly sick of the way that I wrote. You know, if you work on an MFA thesis, it's like regurgitating and rechewing and swallowing and regurgitating and rechewing and swallowing over and over again. And I thought, wow, I am so tired of me as a poet, of everything I do as a poet. And I was walking alone at night and thinking about how sick I was of the way I wrote. And I heard a voice in my head saying, why don't you write like someone else? And, you know, unlike the great prophets and others in our tradition who hear voices in their heads and have a, you know, sacred experience, you know, I'm a smartass. So I just said, like who, you know, who do you have in mind? And I got this bio and this name, Anna Asher. And so it never felt to me like Anna was exactly an idea that I had or a projection of me. And, uh, you know, all I knew about her was that she would write in a way that was totally different from me. And that she had this Holocaust experience, which was clearly an issue. You know, for me as an American poet, you know, my issue is it's fall, there are squirrels. You know, Anna obviously wasn't going to be writing poems like that. Um, and but I didn't know anything else about her or how she related to me. And the first things that came out were these sort of anguished lyrics that were, I was very excited by them, but I knew that I had no idea really what they were about or what to do with them. It took me 5 years to work on the book. And as I did, I kind of backed into realizing that Anna wasn't a character that I was creating. Although she was a way for me to think about things uh, that were important to me. She had a kind of a life of her own, and I'm a fan of the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, um, who um he was sort of alone being a modernist Portuguese poet, and so he split himself into all these different poets. And he insisted that they were each as real as he was, and they wrote in totally different ways. They would write criticism of one another, sometimes scathing. And he didn't consider himself, like he considered himself the student of one of these other poets who he called heteronyms. And Anna is really more of a heteronym. Um, she has an independent existence. And I know that, you know, fiction writers will sometimes talk this way about characters, but I'm not a fiction writer, so I don't know if this is the same thing or not. I know that Anna and I would have fights. She would sometimes write me notes about how frustrated she was that I wasn't getting what she was after. the last section of the book, it really was a fight because I'm interested in the God stuff, and she's talking about God. She's really not interested in God. She was really interested in her mother, and I don't care about her mother. Her mother is a fictional character, right? Why would I care? Why would her relationship with her mother be where I wanted the climax of this work to end up? So Anna and I sort of were fighting it out there, but I never, although I didn't feel that Anna was a part of me or an expression of me, I knew that the process of writing the book was a way of working out things that were important to me. One was my inheritance as an American Jew of that certain moment in history, which I would say was the nadir of, um, in a way, of defining American Jewish identity. It was really defined so much in relation to the Holocaust, and which is a terribly reductive way of thinking about Judaism or Jewishness. Not that the Holocaust wasn't important or meaningful, but it really, I felt, warped a lot of things. And growing up as a child, my education led me to believe that my culture thought there was nothing really better that you could do with yourself than having been killed in the Holocaust. That was the highest point in the moral scale that you could achieve. And um, it just, the idea that Jewishness was defined in terms of mass death and really nothing else was a burden that I was trying to survive through. Another thing that I was troubled by as a kid was the Holocaust theology problem of, how could God allow the Holocaust and this kind of stuff. And so part of what excited me about doing the work on Anna was that I thought, if Judaism can survive Anna, who is absolutely determined to shove God's face and Jewish tradition's face and holiness's face into the maw of her horrible experiences. If Judaism can survive that, then we can really get to a post-Holocaust idea of Judaism. For Anna, though, she's writing in the 1950s. She's in a different culture. She doesn't have any of these issues. She's angry. She's suicidal. Actually, she's too nihilistic to be really suicidal, but that's some of what she's working out. And one thing she doesn't care about is my gender. So when I was writing this, I was, I was me. I was trans. I was hiding my female gender identification. I thought that I always would. I took it for granted that I'd always be writing as a man. And writing in the Book of Anna was a way of um, writing in the voice of a woman. And I expected this to be some sort of trans experience for me. But this is where Anna being a heteronym kind of comes in. Anna wasn't a woman. She wasn't any kind of woman that I had ever met or thought of. She wasn't feminine. I mean, as you'll see when I read you an excerpt in a minute, she's really not, I had not very well developed senses of, femaleness as a way of being human. I kept it at arm's length because of trying to stay in the closet. And Anna just isn't interested in fitting into anybody's categories. So instead of this sort of, well, for a few years, I'll get to have this vicarious female experience without having to risk anything and actually live my identity. Instead, she just blew out of the water all of my ideas about what female gender was. She was really just herself. And I think that she was, the way that she really was summoning me, I think she was doing this, she was challenging me, was she's just absolutely herself. She's monstrous, she's glorious, she's much smarter than I am and a better poet. And she doesn't care what anybody thinks. She has gone through the worst things that can happen, and she's beyond caring. Whereas I was still living my fear. I was defined by my fear of actually living as who I was. And So instead of giving me an example of a woman, Anna gave me an example of what it's like to live as a human being who is not afraid. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And I realized I forgot to mention in my own introduction earlier. Part of this is that I am also a writer. Um, I got my MFA from Chapman University, and also specifically a poet. So Joy and I can connect on this level too, as writers, and sometimes as as writers, we take over the minds of other people, and specifically with persona poetry, there is a line of, are you becoming another person, or is it an exploration of yourself? And I heard in some of what you were saying, you were able to find out a little bit about yourself through of what you were not in Anna. And by exploring Anna and her own uniqueness and what made her a specific individual and a specific person, that was also a way to find out where your boundaries were.
That's a really good way to put it. She ended up seeming more real than I was. And that was, that's chastening. When you're less real than your character, you know that it's time to change your life.
So if you wouldn't mind sharing something from
Yeah.
with Anna.
So the Book of Anna is made out of diary entries where she's talking about her life in the present and the process of writing the poems, and these long poems. And each of the poems is an address to something or someone, and it works with different aspect of Jewish textual tradition. This is from the section called Galam, and so Anna is working with, there's a ton of stuff about golems in Jewish tradition. Um, at this point, this is past the midpoint in the book, and Anna has a pretty good sense of what she's doing, and she knows that she needs to do research in order to work on this book. And one of the people she was a designated survivor in the camp. She was a kid, and these older women gave their lives actually to see that she survived. One of them was a Rebbitzin who talked about this guy, this teacher and bookseller, and she's heard about him being in the Prague market, and she has buttonholed him to learn about golems, which he of course doesn't want to teach her about. She's a woman and so forth and so on. So, but he's starving, so he can't resist the offer of food in her apartment. So this is one of their conversations. Um, so she's asking him about golems, and he says, "A golem doesn't choose. That's the difference between a golem and a man. A golem does what it's created to do. It cannot help but testify to the name kneaded into its limbs. That's why we don't include a golem in a minyan, when even a woman could be counted, according to our sages. A woman can choose, even in the camps. Even when her bones are sinking into the pit, she can praise her creator, Baruch Hashem." I tap my foot impatiently. I have no desire to hear again about the Rebbitzins' virtues. What about the Golem of Prague? He was created to defend the Jews. When he started killing Goyim, what name was he testifying to? Reb Chaim doesn't miss a beat or a bite. He's halfway through the loaf of bread. The holy Maharal Judah Low, may his memory be for a blessing, brought his golem to life by inscribing the word emet, truth, on his forehead. For the golem's purpose was to expose the blood libel by preventing the goyim from hiding the corpses of Christian children in the sacks of flour that were brought into the ghetto to bake Passover matzahs. In the course of the golem's inspections, the first letter of the word, the aleph, became so caked with flour it disappeared. With the aleph erased, the emet became met. Truth became death. The golem had no choice but to kill. Some say the erasure was the work of an evil angel. Some that it was a judgment on the goyim the Maharal was too compassionate to punish. Some that it happened because the goyim refused to sell Jews the highest quality flour. I heard a different story, I say. He stops in mid-sentence because I've removed the loaf of bread from his reach. I heard that the Maharal erased the Aleph himself because that was the only way to stop the Golem when the killing got out of hand. That means the killing was the Golem's truth, his emet. Reb Chaim cuts me off with a dismissive gesture, grabs the last hunk of bread. Pfah! You've been reading parrots, but what sources has he read? He opens his bag and pulls out several small, mold-spotted volumes. Has he read Abulafia? Does he know the Babylonian Talmud? So you're going to teach me the truth about golems, I say? I don't expect him to answer. He already has. I will teach you the truth about golems, he says, shaking crumbs from his beard. The truth is that the golem is a sign of the mercy of God. By allowing man to become a creator of life, the Holy One, blessed be he, makes visible the name that animates every corner of creation. His voice rises and falls, the nasal sing-song of the Cheder, the Juden's tuneless nursery rhyme, death and truth, truth and death. He's speaking to me as though I were a child. You taught girls before the war, didn't you, Reb Chaim? I ask, knowing the answer. His voice doesn't rise again. I taught girls, he says, pulling his hand back from the bowl of fruit as though the apple he was about to take had burned him. I still say Kaddish for them. That's right, Chaim. Praise your creator. What choice do you have? The name that delivered your girls to the gas makes your golems live. So this is the poem. It begins with a quote from the parrot's story, the golem, and Psalm 139. My bone was not hidden from thee when I was made in secret and formed in the depths of the earth. Thine eyes did see my unformed matter. And this is addressed to the Golem of Prague. Emet or met, truth or death, what makes a mound a man? The holy Rabbi Judah Low, who formed your unformed matter, gave you lips and legs and breath, the face of a Slavic peasant, a name, Yassel, son of clay. But when he stamped between your brows the word that made you live, the Aleph flickered in and out. Truth became death, emet, met, as you followed his commands. Yassel, Prague is filled with corpses. Anti-Semites, infants, girls who hid in attics, and those who never reached their houses, and something shaped like a woman, as you were shaped like a man, waiting in the middle of the Charles Bridge for death or truth to make her breathe again. Gaze upon her unformed matter. My bones are not hidden from thee. Midnight. Ants have overrun my kitchen. I kill them as fast as I can. Reminds me of my girlhood, Yassel, circa 1937. Some work as though I wasn't there. Some sprint for shadows and cracks. Some scream to their buried queen in the ineffable language of scent. My mother pounded the piano harder. I threw temper tantrums. The buried queen inhales each scream, hatches generations. The end of the world was over, Yassel. By the time I turned 19, extermination had given way to the bureaucratic grief of clothing and housing thousands of corpses, coughing in the air of a future they weren't supposed to breathe. Displaced persons, Yassel. As it says in Psalm 115, they have hands but feel not, noses but smell not. They have nothing in their throats to say. Shaven bones in barbed wire yards, neither emet nor met can animate their scars. I'll just read this last section. Oh, think of it, Yassel. Adam, God's own golem, face down on the face of the deep, the moment before the moment, the first soul became the last act of creation. Golem, a breath away from humanness, a crack in the ontological curtain, behind which God dresses for redemption, slapping his cheeks with cologne, the way the Maharal slaps you, Yassel, in that first astonishing instant when he opens your eyes and sees you see right through him. It's spring, blood libel season. Judah Low intones a name of God composed of 400 years of humiliation, takes a sharpened instrument, a screw, and scores a word into your forehead. Met, truth, with death inside it. A gust stirs the thick black curtain. Breathe, he says. Your clay nose fills with pollen.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. The image of the golem and the question of what it means to be a being, to be sentient. I see that in so much of your work, of this question of what it means to be human versus what it means to be alive and what it means to be a form in general. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about how that relates to the human condition, of this question of what it means to be alive and to be in a body, and if you had a little bit more to say about that.
Well, I was very excited when Anna got into this golem thing because I did feel that we were getting onto some common ground um, here a little bit, although she was coming at it in a way in the reverse section. Um, it's not so much that she felt cut off from the body that she had been given, as that sense that there was a way of being alive that had any meaning or value through that body had been, was broken in her. But we were both trying to figure out what to do with this. And when she says something shaped like a woman, I'm like, yes, go Anna, that's right. Um, I was also interested in the way that she was thinking about how pain and victimization related to this question of being alive and being sentient and occupying um, a body. You know, one of the things that I felt like I could own when I was not living as myself, I felt like it was perfectly acceptable for me to be miserable. That was true. I really was miserable, and it was socially acceptable for me to live as a miserable person, whereas it wasn't socially acceptable for me to live as well as joy, or as somebody who was joyful and embodied. And Anna talking to the golem is really asking this question about the the animating force, the value of living on rage, living on humiliation, living on all of the things that make life unlivable. And does that make you a person? Is that Emmet? Right? In some ways, it is. Right? In some ways, in the literary story of the Golem of Prague, there's something very true. It's a wish fulfillment thing. It's like Purim is coming up, right? So yes, let's kill all the anti-Semites. There's something true about that. But Anna is, she's sort of been there and done that. It comes out as she keeps talking with Yassel. It turns out that she's killed somebody, and it did make her feel better. She killed somebody who was victimizing her, but she says, if I could do it again every night, maybe I'd get some sleep. Like, it doesn't really push her over the edge into being alive, into into humanness. And so I felt like that was a question that she was asking that I really wasn't, in a way, ready to ask while I was working on the poems. I think that what I knew most about who I really was my misery and this introverted, suicidal rage. And so I was kind of looking at her working her way on the other side that towards something that is a better and more full definition of being human without being ready to follow. The very last line of the poem is she says, Aleph, Aleph. So she ends up reaching the Aleph that turns death into truth. That's how far she gets. And Aleph, of course, is the letter that comes before creation. It's a silent letter. It's pre-manifestation. Um, but um, so she ends up kind of getting back to the nothing that's a moment before creation. And that too was teaching me something that I wasn't ready to learn yet, because when I finally started the gender transition process, I was surprised to find that it was so much about unmaking, that it was like becoming nothing rather than suddenly being this full being that I had always imagined. It was more like getting back to this Aleph before the creation of me, um, and seeing a new life take shape.
Thank you for that. You had said that one of the things that Anna was not interested in was God. And that, of course, is something that you are very interested in. And you have a new project that you are working on now called Shekhinah Speaks. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this new project.
Yes, this project in a way grows out of the um, the book of Anna. One of the great things about Anna was because, again, she's not afraid. She just will say anything. She doesn't censor herself. And she writes with, well, for me, but, there's this sort of terrifying vitality or power in that. And after I wrote the Book of Anna, I've written other things that I liked, but I never dared to do anything like that again. It was always like, no, we need some filters. We need some, there are some limits here. There are things I won't say. Whereas Anna is like, you know, she does not care. So a couple of years ago, when I was at a point of, I'd finished some work and finished The Soul of the Stranger, and I was wondering where to go from there. I thought, it's too bad about that, that Anna voice, that ferocity and everything. That was fun. It wasn't me, but it was kind of fun to be inhabited by that unrestrained power. And I thought, so I like to do something like that again. And I sort of by coincidence ended up backing into writing poems that were persona poems. They were poems in the voice of the Shekhinah, in the sense that you were talking about. And really, they were like dress-up poems. This is Purim again. I was dressing up as the Shekhinah and saying the things that I thought the Shekhinah should say. Any God worthy of the name should want to say the things that I was saying. And it was fun because the Shekhinah also had license to speak and, write in ways that I wouldn't write. But after writing The Soul of the Stranger, and, I was writing a lot about idolatry and people creating gods that are smaller than them. And I looked at those drafts and I was like, oh yeah, this is I have a little God puppet, little Shekhinah puppet that I'm manipulating, and that's really a form of poetic idolatry. I don't feel like I spoiled my own fun there with the theology work that I did. But I was thinking, like, what would the Shekhinah say? I wanted to hear that. What was the voice of the divine? And how would she talk if she really were speaking? So, in other words, was there a way to do the heteronym thing? But I felt like I'd eliminated that possibility because this couldn't be an idol, right? So even a heteronym is part of the human, and I didn't want that. So I came up with the idea of making pools of language by mixing two texts, kinds of texts that weren't mine. One was sections of the book of Isaiah where God is talking, so certified divine language. And the other was articles from Cosmopolitan magazine where that had themes or images that related to the book of Isaiah. And so the Isaiah language would provide the divinity. Like I didn't have to figure out how does God talk because Isaiah's done that work for me. And but Isaiah's God is definitely not female identified or marked as female. And so the Cosmo language would do that. And I would mix the words together and see what voice emerged that clearly wouldn't be mine. So that's what uh, the composition process for making this book. And I'm just going to read one of these um, poems. The book is in its final stage of revision, so I'm hoping it'll be done in the next few months. Um, this poem is called Fragmentation, um, and it definitely feels like a trans poem to me. To some extent, the Shekhinah I relate to as a trans female archetype, because the Shekhinah is somebody who doesn't have a female body, but even the most conservative and devout Jews accept her as female. So, um, so in a way, all of the poems stand for that for me. But this has some more specific identity issues going in. It's called Fragmentation, and the passage from Isaiah contains this epigraph: "When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze." And the Cosmo article is called, "I have 13 different identities living inside me. Here's what our lives are like." And the you in the poem is a singular human you, but for the Shekhinah is the immanent part of God. So she's sort of with each of us, experiencing whatever we experience. But she thinks human beings are fairly similar. So when she says you in these poems, she thinks she's talking to each one of us at once. It's not a plural you, it's individual, but she's talking to sort of the common denominator of every individual you. Who holds your pieces together? Pieces that can't see, pieces that can't hear, pieces blotted out by terror. You don't remember. You have so many histories and only one body, one name, and so many identities living and loving inside you, the way you live and love in me, no more or less real than anyone else, no less splintered, no closer to understanding why I summon you by name. You don't know what I'm talking about. You don't even know I'm talking. I'm a deep dive you don't remember taking into multiple realities, multiple conceptions of self and other, and one inconceivable me, fluttering above your terror that you can't do anything, or that you can, but only by being a different person, different from yourself, different from me. Don't be afraid. I walk with you through the fire. Hold the pieces you're afraid of losing, or maybe just afraid of. The children who suffer and never grow older, the children who were born, and the children who are nothing but gaps in your memory. How many of you are there? Does it matter? I'm always here, holding every other into which you're broken. The jackals, the owls, the self-harming darkness, the splinters of shame and despair that tell you you deserve all the hate you get. I hold them so you can let them go. I remember so you can forget. I'm making you into something new, something unafraid, something infinite. I'm the labyrinth you feel lost inside, the ghost who never ghosts you, whose haunting keeps you alive.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you. Um, you said that that poem, in a way, it's a trans poem, and yet listening to it, obviously, we don't hear those words being said so literally, and that actually makes me think of a piece that you had written in. I'll grab the book. This anthology. I'll hold it up. It's called Troubling the Line, and it is an anthology of trans and genderqueer poetry and poetics. And you have a piece in there called Trans Poetics Manifesto. And you write that trans poetics are techniques that enable poetic language to reflect the kind of complex, unstable, contradictory relations between body and soul, social self and psyche, that those who see ourselves as transgender experience as acute, definitive, life changing. These relations are simultaneously universal. No soul is precisely expressed by a body. No society precisely fits a self. And unique. No non trans person can experience what trans people experience. No two trans people's experiences are identical. Because trans experience is unspeakably unique, it is quintessentially human.
Keep saying.
And this reminds me of also what you wrote about in, as you said, in Soul of the Stranger, about trans experience and how trans experience is this unique experience that is quintessentially human that anyone can experience. They don't have to be trans to have a trans experience, but it's this disconnect between either body and soul or between identified self and perceived self. And that those are experiences that a lot of people have. And it speaks to what it means to have a body and be a soul. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about trans poetics and trans experience and how you relate to those ideas.
Thank you. Yeah. As you were making those connections, I was thinking about what a bad queer person I am, because I keep taking queer experiences and putting them at the center of what it means to be human, which means that instead of being queer, they end up being definitive of humanity. Um, I have a pretty anti-queer relation to being queer, and those quotes show that. And I think that actually that is because of my trans Jewishness. I think because my survival and growing up as a trans person was so bound up with my Jewishness that um, even though I felt like the only one of my kind as a trans person, as a Jew, I was constantly being told that I was connected to all other Jews and Jewish history and Jewish culture. And and I felt that. I felt a deep connection to the Torah and to Jewish holidays, even as I felt really alienated from specific Jewish communities. Um, so somehow it felt to me like the experience of being marginal, of being queer, of being different couldn't actually be absolute, I think. There was some part of me that just never settled into that and accepted the idea that you could divide people, that there could be these divides, absolute divides between people, the binaries, queer and non-queer, trans and cisgender, these different ways of splitting up humanity into mutually exclusive camps, because part of me felt unrelated to anything and part of me felt related to all of Jewish, past, present, and future. And so both of those seemed true to me. And in those quotes, I think you can see that effort. And then when I was trying to develop a sense of what trans poetics meant, Trace, who actually designed the Book of Anna and Troubling the Line, asked me to write a manifesto, a mistake no one has ever made since. Um, but when I was writing it, I was thinking, I approach trans poetics as a formalist. I'm always interested in the formal nature of poetics. And once you think about uh, poetics as like a set of tools, you unlink it from the author, from an identity, right? So I felt like I had to make a choice between saying trans poetics is something that people who are trans or who identify as trans do when they write poetry, or trans poetics are things we can do with language, which means anybody can do them with language. And I, that's the direction that I went. And once I did that, I realized that there is a long tradition of people writing poems that attempt to represent ways of being human for which their societies don't have adequate categories of representation. There's a ton of Dickinson poems that would fall into this category, for example. So trans poetics becomes not even a set of techniques. Like if you do, this, that, and the other thing, then you are engaging in trans poetics. It's the effort to write, to use language in ways that represent identities or ways of being human that can't readily be represented in terms of a culture. So like when Emily Dickinson starts a poem, I'm afraid to own a body. I'm afraid to own a soul. And you're like, well, what the heck is left? If you're afraid to own a body and a soul, who is saying I? Like, what do you mean by that? And, I hear those lines, I'm like, yes, yes, that's my political party. I support that platform. So to me, that's a transpoetic exercise. And you can marshal a lot of different techniques to make language represent those kinds of things. And of course, you can have other artistic media that do this same thing. And because there are always holes in culture, always ways of being human that don't have easy forms of representation or intelligibility, you never need to have writer's block if you are dedicated to trans poetics. So the Shekhinah is a trans poetic, the Shekhinah poems are a trans poetic exercise because divinity can't be represented in terms of human cultural categories. That's the upside of the anti-idolatry thing. Once I thought, oh crap, I can't just make the Shekhinah what I think she should be. The upside of it was it became an exercise in trans poetics, trying to represent not a way of being human, but a being who is present and alive and speaking, who can't be understood in terms of our categories. And like Anna taught me a bunch of things, one of the things that Shekhinah taught me is that God does this in many of the prophetic books, and also I think in human lives, by rapidly shifting from one form of self-representation to another. So human beings do need God to identify in ways we can recognize, like a burning bush. No, it's the voice from a bush. No, it's the angel speaking from the bush, right? God just keeps shifting from one representation to another. And if you shift from one representation to another fast enough, the people who, who speak to you have to realize that you are not any of the representations. God is not in the whirlwind. God is not in the thunder. God is something other than these manifestations that tell us God is is here. And I think a lot of trans people are struggling with some similar issues. Some of us, I think, find that the materials of our culture, we can repurpose them in ways that work, pretty well for us on a day-to-day basis. And some of us um, are always, actually do try to cobble things together in ways that make it clear that we aren't this or that. Like when you say I'm non-binary, in a way, you're saying, God is not in the whirlwind. If I'm not in the whirlwind, I'm not in the thunder. If you hear a still small voice and it's not all those things, but it's somebody who's really there, maybe you're getting a clue.
Yeah, that's great. And I think also this idea that that these are at once universal experiences, and another time, every single individual who experiences them probably feels as if they are experiencing something that no one has ever experienced before, because as it ties to our unique identities, it is shaped by those unique identities and it becomes its own unique experience. And so I think I mean, I appreciate your perspective of trans poetics and experiences being this broad spectrum of not identity, but these moments in time where we experience these very human feelings of this disconnect. And it sort of brings us back to the question of what it means to be an individual and also what it means to be trans and or Jewish. And I think that having any sort of marginalized identity, it can feel othering when that marginalized identity is highlighted. And it can feel like potentially being pigeonholed or boxed in or tokenized. But on another hand, it can also feel like it's a window into this great expansive experience that many people can relate to and can identify with, and potentially a way to relate to way more people outside of yourself. And so I was wondering, and I know we don't have very much time left, but for maybe our last question, how do you personally navigate the tension between being a, a person, being a poet, being a Jew, and also being a trans poet or a trans Jewish poet, and how do you navigate those identities?
I don't know that I do. I mean, I feel like navigation and I don't, we've certainly met, but I'm not sure how much we have in common. Um, I think the longer I've lived as myself, the the less I've worried about where the different aspects of myself fit in terms of the different pigeonholes, the less navigating I would say that I do. I end up feeling like it's weird because at a certain point I realized, I'm never going to fit the gender binary definition of woman. And one of the great achievements of feminism, I think, is showing that anything that women do is what women do, right? So this was a huge breakthrough. It was one of the great blows against the strong version of the gender binary, which says people can only be what gender defines them as being. And feminism says, well, actually, no. If a woman does this, this is something a woman does. It's not that she ceases to be a woman when she does it, or she's not allowed to do it because she's a woman. Um, so the category of woman becomes co-equal with the category of human. And ideally, that would happen for men also. But one of the problems with being at the top end of a hierarchy is you tend to be a little short on the liberation movements You get so many goodies out of the categories and the hierarchies, but you're not necessarily able to effectively push back against them. You know, you always pay a price for being an identifiable, you know, in one of those pigeonholes. So when but I realized at a certain point, there are people who will accept me as a woman. This is what I, want to identify as, but other people won't accept me. I'm not willing to fight over whether I am or whether I'm not. And so once I started to do that, it was kind of heartbreaking, but it was also very liberating in the way that Anna grew out of the liberation of feeling like I don't have an audience. So I don't have to worry about pleasing an audience or restricting myself for an audience. I can just do whatever comes. It's like, well, I don't have to worry about fitting into these pigeonholes anymore. So when I'm in a Jewish context, I want to bring all of the trans and poet aspects of my experience and the teacher aspects and the parent aspects of my experience. And when I'm in the, you know, trans neighborhood of my experience, I rather awkwardly want to bring the Jewish and the poet stuff and when you're not in a religious context, the religious stuff, very awkward to bring along with you into queer settings, and also American poetry settings doesn't tend to be very hospitable to, folks who have ongoing relationships with the divine or whatever, right? So I just don't divide myself up in these kinds of ways. So I don't navigate. Um, yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate the reframing of the question and the gentle pushback. And from what I hear of that too, it's a reframing of our identities as marginalized identities, understanding that that is the socio-cultural, political position that we are in. But when we think about them as identities that we hold and inhabit, they really can be expansive identities, much more so than marginal identities, where we have more to bring and more to give because of those identities. And it can be hard to feel like we want to just put them on the back shelf and not bring them to the communities and the people that we meet.
And I just want to end with a sort of a commercial for the divine here. One of the things about the Shekhinah is that, like I say, you to her is just each one of us. We're not that different from each other. She doesn't get that. There aren't like gender labels or anything in there. Um, but each of us is the center of her attention. And one of I think, the revolutionary forces that's planted within even traditional religions that are ossified and corrupted by association with power structures and institutions is that God is really the always outside of all of that stuff. And to the extent that we're connected with and created by and reflecting of the God that is outside these marginalizing structures, they're not real from the perspective of that God. And so we're not bound by them. We're not really marginal. We're not really marginalized. These are relative, transient positions. And I feel like the Shekhinah is always saying, well, do you want to see yourself in these ways that make you feel like crap? Or do you want to see yourself the way I see you? It's up to you.
Yes, exactly. And I think that that is also such, it's a reason why it's so important to have ideas such as trans theology and to have spaces where trans Jews can come together and talk about theology and talk about God. So we can share that these are our experiences too, and that we experience God and we experience holiness and we experience the joy of holy sacred community. And just to say that we hope to cultivate more of these spaces. Thank you for being in conversation so we can really just skim the surface of this because there's so much more to talk about. but we are so grateful for your teaching and for your scholarship and for your humanity and what you bring to us. And we are also looking forward to more learning and more time in holy sacred community as we get closer to the convening, which will be on March 31st. And we hope that everyone can join us to that as well.
Thank you so much. I'm really so grateful for your deep and wise reading of my work. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. It was an honor. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.